Well, let's look just at the near term. It's very hard to look ahead. Those who do it usually get burned and chastised for it. But let's look weeks or maybe a month ahead and talk about what the war termination operation that the Russians hope to launch might look like and what its objectives would be. Not that we know anything about what would actually happen, but if, as I think we're both confident, Mr. Putin does want to have a fourth phase that terminates the war smartly, if not decisively, then what would actually achieve that? So we're not talking about what will happen, but what both of us, mostly you think, would be required to actually achieve a decisive operation.
Well, I think it's important to go back and remember that there was never any intention whatsoever
Right.
to conquer all of Ukraine.
Right.
Remember, this place is the size of Texas. And to be perfectly frank, the Russians really don't want to have to manage millions of Western Ukrainians who have absolutely no desire to live under Russian rule or government.
Right.
They never did. In fact, Putin, in a speech given back in 2015 or 16, it was sort of a statement he made during a question and answer period. I think it was in St. Petersburg. Somebody asked him, well, what about the Western Ukrainians and what do you think they want and so forth? He said, well, let's be frank. They'd probably be happier under Polish administration than they would be under our administration.
Right.
Didn't bother him in the least. I think what he wants is a clear, unambiguous outcome. Ukrainian armed forces are gone.
Right.
They're devastated, unambiguously defeated. This government in Kiev is gone.
Right.
It's vanishing. Either it is moved to Poland or it is being destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's the first condition. Then the next thing is, well, we're going to redraw this map. Now, I think he would prefer to negotiate over some of that. He would like to have a partner, a strategic partner. But if he has to redraw it, I think he's likely to simply say the Dnieper River is now the western boundary of Russia. I think that's his inclination. And I think at the moment it's the inclination because his fear is, well, let's assume we just take the southern areas, the areas that are traditionally Russian, down to Odessa from Kharkov and call it a day.
It's a long front. It's very vulnerable.
It's vulnerable. It's a long front. And who's to say a future government is not going to try and move over that Dnieper River, build up a force on the western side or on the eastern side, and resume stupid
absolutely.
hostile
That
operations?
would be a classic standard revanchism, translated into endless military baiting and incessant pinpricks, if not full-scale offensives. So,
and if he takes our threats seriously,
right,
that we're going to try and turn Ukraine into some form of Afghanistan,
right.
He wants a clear boundary that he can easily defend and monitor what's going on the other side.
So right now, the Ukrainian army has been enticed into the cauldron, a potential cauldron at Bakhmut, which, as you say, the Russians are intentionally not making into a cauldron in order to entice more. If there is an operation, let's just look, if possible, at the operational aspects. People love to draw arrows on a map, but what would be an effective operation that would not outrun itself, that would not, in the famous Clausewitzian universe,
itself.
It would not reach the culminating point of attack before achieving its objective. So what would that look like?
Well, there are three very large concentrations of Russian forces.
Okay.
You have the one in southern Ukraine, and this is beyond the troops that were there several months ago.
Right.
And then another concentration east of Kharkov. If you just go due east from Kharkov into western Russia, yes.
Yeah, okay.
In that area, you have another concentration. And then you have a concentration now in White Russia or Belarusia.
Yeah.
And that concentration is probably south of Minsk and between Minsk and maybe just north of the Ukrainian border west of Kiev.
Yeah, okay.
That's where the major concentrations are. 75,000 Belarusian troops, and the Belarusians have made it clear that they are with the Russians and the Russians are with them. But most of them are now committed to the border with Poland and Lithuania.
Just on that note, I mean, just recently, very recently, yesterday, there was a sudden surprise announcement that the Belarusian forces will be under Russian command. is that being done simply as a way to preserve unity of command if those forces are actually launched on an offensive, or is it a way to ensure that nervous Ukrainians who are very worried about Kiev will keep a large percentage of their forces tied up against the Belarusian border?
Well, I think both of those are true.
Uh,
The second one is a more difficult proposition because they're down to about 190,000 effectives left
in the whole
in the
Ukrainian
Ukrainian
army?
army.
And how big are the numbers that could be unleashed in a Russian offensive?
Well, they've got over 500,000 concentrated in those three areas, and those numbers continue to grow.
And that doesn't include the Belarusian army.
Right, doesn't include the Belarusians. And I think the other part of the issue is Belarusia wants the Western allies in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland to understand that an attack on them will be treated as an attack on Russia.
Right, right. I think that.
So disabuse them of some notion that they can intervene against Minsk.
So there's powerful symbolism to have
Yeah.
this unity.
But they've also said that if the Russians strike south into northern Ukraine, that Belarus will support that with troops.
Well, I mean, they could. There's always talk about final cutting of the rail links to whatever Ukrainian forces are still left in the east. But is it really necessary to launch a strike south from Belarus, and what would that hope to achieve? What would be the objectives?
Well, this is an interesting question because they have the potential for 2 or 3 operational axes.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the goals of this new offensive will be to permanently cut off Western Poland from Ukraine. In other words, to ensure the Ukrainians are not being supplied any longer with Western weapons over that border. And if you look at the concentration of force that's up there, in broad numbers, we've counted 1,500 tanks, 1,000 rocket artillery systems,
This isn't all three
drone systems.
concentrations,
Yeah,
is it?
it's all three. Thousands of armored fighting vehicles, thousands of conventional artillery.
Yeah.
How these are going to be distributed I'm not privileged to that. I don't know, but I see a substantial enough concentration in Belarusia that it makes sense to strike downwards,
Right.
which would be west of Kiev,
Yes.
but east of the Polish border. And if you
Yeah.
look at the map, you can go from Belarusia down to Zhytomyr,
Right.
from Zhytomyr to Vinica,
Yes.
and it's a short stint then to Moldova.
That's
And see,
right.
Moldova is important because we've eyed Moldova repeatedly
Oh, yeah, I
as a
know.
potential jump-off point for operations against the Russians in southern Ukraine.
Plus,
but-
there's Transnistria.